At the core of this debate is a very simple but important question. When people are dying because of organs are unavailable, should society allow willing students to be compensated or donating uh, organs? On government, we believe the answer is yes, because the current system is failing. Right now, thousands of patients remain on waiting lists while their conditions worsen. Many die before compatible donors ever found. Meanwhile, organ trading already exists, just illegally, dangerously, and under the control of criminal networks. People are dying from shortages, selling organs illegally, and more. Government's role is not to preserve moral purity while preventable deaths continue. Our role is to create a system that saves most lives, minimizes exploitations, and protects everybody. Before moving on, we want to portray on what we would like what we would have in this world of organ donors and more. So we would not just have no regulations, we had strict policies, regulations, strict medical conditions so that everybody could be safe. And yeah, so moving on straight away to our first argument is legalizing organizing organ trading saves life by increasing organ supply. So the biggest problem in organ transplantation today is not medical inability; it is shortage. We have already processed the medical technology to save many patients, but there are simply not enough donated organs available. As a result, patients will wait years for transplants. Conditions will worsen and many die before receiving treatment. The current voluntary donation system cannot meet demand. Governments solve this by introducing financial incentive. Mechanism one, compensations of dramatically increases supply. Human behavior responses to incentive. Society already accepts
You are, sir.
compensation for no thank you physically risky or demanding activities such as dangerous labor and more. In all of these situations, people voluntarily use their bodies in exchange for financial benefit. There is no principal reason why the organ donation, which can save a human life, should be treated differently. Second mechanism is that one donor can completely transform another life. A single kidney donation can save many people and restore
You are, sir.
quality of life. So, no thank you. This means relatively small increases in organ supply can create enormous social benefit. And impact is that government uniquely prevents thousands of preventable deaths. This is the largest impact in this debate because no principle of a moral discovery outweighs the loss of human lives. Uh, Moving on to our second argument, legalization destroys the black market. Opposition acts as though banning organ selling prevents organ trade. This is false. Demand for organs does not disappear, and this underground markets are where worst exploitation happens. And why is black market bad? It's so unsafe and it's only profit driven. Moving on to our first mechanism, black markets thrive under prohibition. Right now, illegal organ markets already exist in the world. There's in these systems, it's very unsafe and, as I said, very profit driven. Because the black market is illegal, participants cannot seek legal protection or just any sort of protection at all. And this creates perfect conditions for exploitations and just getting money straight away. Mechanism two, legalization replaces criminal control with medical oversight. Government removes power from traffickers and places the process made inside regulated healthcare system. Under legalization, people receive medical screening and specially trained medical screening so that it increases safety for everybody and helps everybody. And impact is that government we reduce human trafficking, unsafe things, and we believe that this road can save everybody. And I am proud to propose.
In the status quo, commercial organ selling is illegal in almost every country in the world. Organ transplantation operates through systems of altruistic donation, voluntary, unpaid, regulated by medical ethics. Waiting lists are long, but shortages are real, and that is the genuine problem proposition is responding to right now. But the existence of a problem does not validate any particular solution, and the opposition's case here is that this just makes things worse and whatnot. How to oppose? First, moving on to rebuttals, they say that it saves lives. However, although saving lives matters, but like it's not necessarily that if we're endangering another to do so, we could actually save more lives by like a commercial market like does not create organs, it extracts them from living people who feel like they have no other option, which is not just saving lives, that's trading one person's desperation for another person's survival and calling it healthcare. They'd also talk about black markets and how this legalization would eliminate it. However, this argument just basically assumes that the legal market will be affordable enough to actually like replace the illegal one, and like it won't. And wealthy patients will actually use this legal market, and like patients who can't afford legal prices will still turn back to black market brokers who now like would operate in a world where organ selling has become normalized and legitimized. Legislation doesn't kill the black market; it rather gives it better cover, and that's why this argument doesn't stand. Therefore, my first argument is that human bodies shouldn't be up for sale. The human body is not property; it is a precondition of all personhood, and bodily integration is a right, not a commodity. Rights, by definition, cannot be bargained away under financial pressure and is still meaningfully called rights. When a person sells an organ because debt has closed every other door, what is being exercised is not a right; it's actually the exhaustion of a last option. Legalizing that transaction doesn't protect bodily autonomy; it rather puts a price on it, which is the opposite and what we do not want. And there's a deeper objection that goes beyond consequences. And some things shouldn't be for sale, not because buying them is always harmful, but because commodifying them then degrades something important about how we relate to ourselves and to one another. And the body is not merely property; it is the side of personhood. And when we allow internal organs to be purchased and sold, we treat the body as like a bundle of separable, transferable parts, and we treat persons as an individual into like as like divisible into components of market prices. This is barely like merely a symbolic concern, and the language of markets shapes behavior. And once organs have prices, pressures will emerge from families, creditors, institutions to actually realize that value. Bodily integrity, the right to remain whole without financial coercion, would be quietly but genuinely eroded. Some domains, votes, children, criminal justice, etc., we deliberately fence off from market logic because we understand that price setting changes the thing itself. Organs belong in that category too. In their world, we don't allow votes to be sold because democracy requires some things to remain structurally beyond the reach of money. And why shouldn't that principle apply to humans and their organs too? The human body deserves the same protection as a firm judgment that persons are not divisible into parts with price tags. Our second argument, therefore, is that the market cannot be regulated properly. Proposition would tell you here that the solution to exploitation and harm is simply good regulation, to set a fair price, require medical follow-up, license the brokers, etc. This might sound reasonable here, but it has never worked anywhere. The opposition's premise here is that it cannot work structurally by the nature of what is being sold. Organ markets generate enormous profit margins. Where enormous profit exists, regulatory capture follows. The industry is being regulated again influence over the regulators themselves. We have watched it happen in pharmaceutical markets and in financial markets and private prison systems and whatnot. There's no reason to believe organ markets would actually uniquely be immune. And the consequences of regulatory failure here is not financial losses or environmental damage. They are actually people carved open under substandard conditions, coerced into procedures they didn't fully understand and discarded afterwards. And proposition is of offering you here a theoretical market operating under ideal conditions. However, the opposition rather is asking you to judge the policy by the market that will actually exist, and therefore I'm so proud to oppose. Thank you.
What should society do when prohibition clearly fails? Because throughout history, banning something does not automatically make it disappear. When there is like massive demand, economic desperation, or whatever, markets continue to exist regardless of legality. And just because there was a ban of alcohol in 1920s in the US, it didn't stop the production of it. The only thing prohibition changes is whether these activities happen safely and transparently under the regulation, or it dangerously and illegally happens in the shadows in black markets. And the distinction matters enormously in this debate because organ selling already exists and people are already buying organs and selling organs and being exploited in illegal systems right now. So as government, our role is not to defend the idealized version of reality, but our role is to reduce harm, save lives, and create the safest possible system for the people that are actually involved in this organ selling. And that's exactly what legalization actually achieves. And before we move on to our third argument, some rebuttals. So they talked about how creates like it's like there's like bodily autonomy. And opposition argues that poor like people are being forced by economic like desperation or whatever. So consent is like not truly like voluntary or whatever. But this standard is just not it's like impossible to apply consistently because people are already use their bodies for money in ways that involve serious like physical risks such as construction work, any activities that like require their bodies such as like sports or whatever, and mining. And these sources are often driven by financial needs as well. And yes, society still recognizes adults as like capable of making like rational trade-offs between risk and economic benefit. And also rebutting to how like they said about how it cannot be regulated properly. However, first like imperfect regulation is not like an argument against legalization because almost every major industry carries risk of abuse such as like medicine, labor, finance, or whatever. And we do not ban these systems entirely. We regulate them just because regulated systems are still far safer than illegal ones like black markets. And second, opposition word is comparatively worse because the market already exists underground. And when organ selling is illegal, traffickers control the process and surgeries become unsafe because of the like illegalization and the dangerous like organs they're using. And governments at least allow, as government, we at least allow like medical oversight, like standardized compensation and whatever. And even if regulation is imperfect, it is infinitely safer than abandoning the entire industry to criminal networks. So now moving on to our third argument, which is on how no, thank you. Prohibition is what truly exploits like the poor, and actually legalization gives them the protection and the bargaining power. And opposition's central emotional appeal is that poor people like or whatever will be forced to sell organs because of economic desperation. But this argument, this is, but what they argue is to just fundamentally like misunderstanding what like when exploitation actually comes from, and people are not exploited because the organ selling exists, but people are exploited because poverty exists. And banning organ sales does absolutely nothing to remove poverty or desperation. And poor people already make dangerous physical sacrifices for survival every single day through like hazardous construction work, and people who have labor for their job. And society already accepts many of these risks because audience are considered capable weighing difficult trade-offs between physical risk and economic reward. And so the problem is not that risky choices is that like not that risky choices exist, and the problem is when those like choices happen without protection, and that is exactly what opposition actually creates. And first layer of mechanism here, prohibition actually pushes desperate people into the criminal system because when organ selling is illegal, desperate people who still choose to sell organs cannot access safe hospitals or legal contracts. Instead, the entire process becomes controlled by traffickers and like middlemen, and that means donors are often underpaid, like medically endangered, and because the transaction itself is illegal, victims cannot safely report abuse or seek legal protection. So prohibition does not remove the exploitation, but it guarantees the exploitation happening in the worst possible conditions. Second layer mechanism, legalization shifts power away from the criminals and towards the donors, and as government, we completely change the structure of the transactions because under legalization, donors receive the proper medical like care as they like transfer organs, or surgeries occur in like regulated hospitals instead of like black market, like somewhere in like random buildings. And this matters because the donor now has legal rights and bargaining power actually like with their organs. And the comparative here is that in the opposition world, it isn't like safer, cleaner, or like even exploitation free, and their world still has desperation, like illegal organ markets and whatever. And the only difference is that vulnerable people face these harms without regulation or protection, and government, as government, we at least minimize the damage by bringing the process to transparent healthcare system by legalizing it. And at the end of the day, opposition prioritizing like preserving moral purity, like such as like no one should ever sell organs. Proud to.
If a regulated market truly protects sellers and saves lives, government has spent this entire debate making the case for why we should exploit poor people more safely, not why we should stop exploiting them. So proud to oppose. Moving on to rebuttals first, they firstly claimed how legalizing organ selling saves lives by like increasing the supply and whatnot. So like the supply argument assumes that the shortage of organs is like purely a problem of quantity, and that adding financial incentives will produce more organs without changing who those organs come from or under what conditions they are obtained. Both assumptions are wrong. The people who sell their organs under a commercial system are overwhelmingly like going to be the people in financial desperation. So people who are not making a genuinely free choice but are responding to economic pressure that leaves them with no realistic alternative, that is not an increase in voluntary supply. That is rather like a conversion of like poverty into like a harvesting mechanism where they like actually exploit like the poor. Beyond that, the evidence from the only country that legalized kidney selling, Iran, shows that commercial organ markets do not eliminate the waiting list, do not improve like transplant outcomes and do not produce the supply increase government is predicting because of the quality of organs sourced from economically desperate sellers is consistently lower, and health risks to recipients are constantly higher. And government has never engaged with the Iranian evidence directly, and they cannot because it is the only real world data point available, and it does not support their case. Our side is the only one that takes seriously both the quantity and the quality of the organ supply, and on quality commercial markets consistently underperform non-commercial ones because financial incentives create strong pressure to conceal health conditions that would disqualify a seller in the first place. Second rebuttal against their claim about how a regulated market would protect sellers. So regulation is only as effective as the system of enforcing it and the incentives operating within it. A commercial organ market creates enormous financial incentive for sellers to conceal disqualifying health conditions in the first place, for brokers to misrepresent the health of sellers to buyers, and for buyers to accept organs from sources they would reject if the transaction were not financial. So every one of those incentives works directly against the goals of regulation and whatnot. So beyond that, the population most likely to sell organs, people in poverty, people in developing countries, people with limited legal and limited access to legal resource and whatnot, are precisely the populations least able to effectively navigate a regulatory system, least likely to understand their rights within it, and least likely to successfully enforce those rights when they are violated. So regulation in theory and regulation in practice are completely different things, and government has never explained how the regulatory framework overcomes the specific incentives structures that make organ markets resistant to effective oversight. Before I move on to the rebuttal again, I'll take the POI.
So how does banning organ selling help patients when they are waiting for transplants very desperately on your side?
Of course, there are other alternatives than only selling these organs. For example, we can use other biology techniques where we can use these alternatives from other animals, or other alternatives such as using other transplants that are very identical or similar to these humans. Of course, then are you saying that instead of using these other alternatives, exploiting these poor, exploiting these people, even if they don't want to sell these organs, since they are forced and pressured from the economic pressure, do you think this is more right? No, I believe not. So, and then last rebuttal against their claim about how the current system already has a black market legislation how it brings into the open, there'll be more legalized stuff and whatnot. So the black market argument is one of the most commonly made cases for legalizing harmful practices, and it consistently overstates what legalization actually achieves. So legalizing organ selling does not eliminate the black market because it legitimizes the underlying transaction and expands the overall market, while the black market continues to operate at the lower end of the price range for sellers who cannot meet even the minimal standards of the legal market. And beyond that, normalizing organ selling as a legal and acceptable commercial transaction changes the social and ethical framework within which decisions about organ procurement are made. So it shifts the default from donation, which carries a social meaning of generosity and community, which is another alternative we also talked about, to transaction, which carries no such meaning and actively crowds out the altruistic motivation that sustains donation and systems where there's a pressure and whatnot. So proud to oppose. Thank you.
Before I move on to our team's two clashes, I would like to mention a few rebuttals. So our first rebuttal is on how the POI was mentioned about how we can use animal organs as an alternative instead. So the opposition says that commercial organ selling, so we should use animal organs or future medical technology. However, we say that animal organ transplants and these technological medicine are often experimental or extremely limited, and thus they're very expensive. So patients need organs now, not uncertain future technology that might help them on. And second of all, opposition keeps on saying that selling organs is immoral because the human body should not be commercialized. However, we say that the body is already involved in compensated risks and medical decisions, as our second speaker had mentioned about how surgeries and those working conditions, and we are not selling humans. We're compensating people for more voluntary medical donation that saves life. Thus, moral comfort is less important than preventing avoidable deaths. And moving on to our first class. Our first class is about preventing exploitation versus saving lives. So the opposition keeps on saying that poor people will feel forced to sell their organs for money, and human bodies should not become products. However, we say that the current system, no thank you, exploits vulnerable people through illegal black markets, and thus banning organ selling does not stop desperation. It only makes it more dangerous. And moving on to why we take this clash, a few reasons why we take three reasons why we take this clash. Number one, opposition completely ignores reality. Illegal organ selling already exists because people are
POI, sir.
desperate for money, no thank you, and patients are desperate to live. And under prohibition, surgeries are safe and criminals are controlled under the market. And opposition defends a system that already causes exploitation without safety. And second of all, regulation reduces harm. So government creates medical screening and those things.
POI, sir.
No, thank you. So regulation is safer than pretending the black market does not exist at all. And third, lastly, bodily autonomy matters because adults already make risky decisions involving their bodies for money, such as dangerous jobs and military services. And government trusts adults to make informed decisions about their own bodies. So opposition is paternalistic by removing people's ability to choose. I'll take your POI.
You say our alternatives are too expensive, but a kidney seller in a developing country receiving a one-time payment while bearing a lifetime of health costs is also expensive, just not to you. So who exactly is bearing the cost in your model?
Okay, so we're saying here that this is expensive, but at the same time, even if a kidney selling is more offensive, more expensive, still it's better than taking risks for using animal organs. So it's going to be really risky for these people. So the people don't want to do it at all. I hope that answers your POI. And moving on to our second clash. Our second clash is about moral discomfort versus practical healthcare outcomes. So the opposition keeps on saying that selling organs is unethical and healthcare should not be commercialized. However, we say that ethics should improve human well-being, not blocking life-saving treatment. And the current donation system is failing because there are not enough organs. And three reasons why we take this clash. Number one, the current system already fails patients. Many patients suffer for wear or are dying waiting for transplants. So opposition offers no realistic solution to increase organ supply significantly. And government, however, we directly solve the shortage problem. And even if it doesn't solve the problem at all, it's better than not giving any effects to the problem. And second of all, incentives increase donations and financial compensation motivates more people to donate. So more donors mean shorter waiting lists and faster treatments. So opposition relies more on voluntary donation, which has already proven insufficient. And last of all, healthcare should be prioritized outcomes. So opposition focus heavily on what feels wrong, and we focus on survival and treatment. So moral discomfort is less important than preventing deaths. And a few points on weighing here. So the opposition protects moral symbolism, and we protect human survival. So the value of saving thousands of lives outweigh the discomfort about financial compensation. And last points on blaming here. So the government world is about more organs available and more lives saved. However, we are saying that there's going to be more lives saved and more lives able to be living. So however, the opposition's world is organ shortages continue. However, they are not taking chances. So therefore, I'm very proud to oppose.
Before I move on to my two clashes, let me just first move on to my rebuttals. First of all, they also talked about other alternatives and how it's too risky. Government saying alternatives are too expensive actually proves our point. With their model relies on poor people's bodies being a cheaper option. Instead of investing in ethical long-term solutions, they normalize exploitation simply because it's more convenient and profitable. That is exactly why commercialization is dangerous. The limitations and costs of alternative methodologies stem from insufficient investment in their development. These technologies are still in early stages, much like past innovations such as dialysis and chemotherapy, which were once considered too risky and expensive. Over time, medical technologies tend to become more accessible and affordable as investment grows. Additionally, the government's model for commercial organ market risks health issues for sellers, including reduced kidney function and increased long-term health problems, which are well documented and permanent. Now, I want to just simply rebut their point about how the government already trusts people in status quo. The government's comparison to dangerous job is flawed because those roles don't involve permanently losing part of your body. A construction worker can quit or hopefully recover. An organ donor under commercialization cannot undo that harm. So trusting people to take a reversible risk is not the same as normalizing irreversible bodily exploitation. Moving on to the first question: saving lives versus creating a market for human bodies. Opposition framing is that not every life-saving policy is automatically justified. The moment society allows organs to be bought and sold, human bodies stop being treated as inherently valuable and instead become economic assets. Under commercialization, access to survival increasingly depends on wealth, while the burden of donation falls disproportionately on the poor. Healthcare
healthcare systems should solve organ shortages through stronger public donation systems, opt-out donation policies, better medical infrastructure, and public awareness campaigns, not by creating a marketplace where the poor literally sell parts of themselves to survive financially. Government's framing was simple, right? Commercialization increases supply, and increased supply sees lives. There's an argument that many people die while waiting for organ transplants because there are not enough voluntary donors. They're introducing financial incentives. More people will be willing to donate organs, right? So why is this wrong? The flaw in government's argument is that they treat organ supply as a purely economic problem while ignoring the social condition that create willing sellers in the first place. Their world only functions because inequality exists. The people most likely to sell organs are not wealthy individuals casually making a choice. They're financially desperate people with limited alternatives. Government attempts to sanitize society by calling it choice, but economic desperation heavily distorts concept, right? So opposition wins this class because our world preserves both human dignity and ethical healthcare systems. Governments will may increase organ supply in the short term, but it does so by creating a system where the poor bear physical risk so the wealthy can survive. Moving to the second class, economic exploitation versus people already risk their bodies. Opposition framing is that organ selling is fundamentally different from labor exploitation because organs are irreversible, permanent, and tied directly to bodily integrity. A construction worker, can leave their job. A miner can eventually seek alternative employment. But someone who sells a kidney can never recover that organ again. This matters because commercialization permanently transfers health risk out of economically vulnerable people for the benefit of those with greater financial power. Also, argues that exploitation becomes far more dangerous when the harm is irreversible, the decision is driven by poverty, and the human body itself becomes the product being sold. Government's second major response was that society already accepts dangerous labor under capitalism. They argued that poor people already sacrifice bodies in industries like construction, mining, etc., right? So I'm not just rebut this. Their comparison completely collapses because labor and organ selling, as I repeat again and again, are not equivalent. They are not responded to properly. Dangerous labor still preserves the principle that the worker's body remains fundamentally their own. Organ commercialization crosses a moral line by allowing permanently bodily extraction to become economically transactional, right? Additionally, government accidentally proves their point. Their entire defense relies on the existence of poverty and desperation. They never explain why the ethical response to exploitation is to commercialize even more intimate forms of it. If poor people are already vulnerable in dangerous industries, that should motivate governments to reduce exploitation, not normalize a system where financial desperation pushes people into selling organs. And that is why our side is so happy to propose. Thank you. Oppose, sorry.
If government's standard for rejecting our alternative is that they carry risk, they have spent this entire debate defending a system where poor people permanently remove healthy organs from their bodies for a one-time payment, and somehow that is a less risky option. Even if they say that their side is legalized and it's not risky, the fact that something is legal has never made it safe. Cigarettes are legal and that did not make them less deadly for the people who use them. So proud to oppose. Moving on to setting up the debate first. So government came into this debate with two arguments that they kept returning to. A regulated market protects sellers, and a legalization saves lives from increasing supply. Every time opposition dismantled those arguments, government came back to the same 2 points without even answering the rebuttals we gave them. The pattern matters because it tells you that government's case has no depth beyond its surface that they keep on repeating constantly. When you push on either argument, it collapses immediately, and government has no response prepared for what's underneath. So government said that legalization increased organ supply and therefore saves lives. We pointed to Iran, the only country with a legal commercial kidney market, which still has a transplant waiting list after decades of operations, and government never answered that. We pointed out that organ sources from economically desperate sellers are constantly lower quality because sellers have strong financial incentives to conceal disqualifying health conditions. Government never answered that either. The supply increase government promises is real. The outcomes improvement government promises has never been demonstrated in any real world context, and the only available evidence points in the opposite direction. So saving lives is the most powerful argument government has, and it does not survive even with the evidence. So government said a well-regulated market protects sellers from exploitation. We pointed out that the populations most likely to sell organs are precisely the populations least able to navigate a regulatory system, least likely to understand their rights within it, and least likely to successfully enforce those rights when they are violated. And government never answered that. We pointed out that commercial organ markets create financial incentives for sellers to conceal health conditions, for brokers to misrepresent sellers, and for buyers to accept organs they would otherwise reject, all of which work directly against the goals of regulation, and government never answered that either. So we take this question home. So proud to oppose.
On what the government model actually does. Under our policy, organ selling is not a free-for-all market. It is a state-regulated system where all transactions occur through licensed hospital. Donors undergo strict medical and screening, and we kept saying that, and we kept saying that, but they do not respond to this. And yeah, this directly replaces today's reality: an unregulated black market controlled by traffickers, not patients or states. So when opposition talks about the exploitation, they're complaining comparing a criminal unsafe system versus a regulated medically supervised system, which is a model. That comparison matters. Opposition's burden is to prove prohibition is better, not just safer in theory, and that the poor people, like, they need to protect these people. Opposition cannot be saying, like, win by saying this could be just abused and things like that. Every policy can be abused. Their burden is way heavier. They must prove that keeping prohibition leads to better outcomes than regulation. And three, their burden is incomplete because when the opposition says the poor will be just forced to sell, they will never prove why, like, this is lower in illegal markets, or why banning this by banning payment remove economic desperation. We concede vulnerability exists, but the comparison is unregulated exploitation with no protection versus regulated compensation with medical safeguard with no and legal consent checks. We must prove prohibition reduces coercion in practice, not just claim it, but they didn't, which is why they lose this debate. Finally, weighing the government model is concrete: regulation, safety, oversight, and more. Opposition burden is to prove that despite this prohibition and the poor people, getting selling these forcefully it's more harm. It produces more harm, but they do not prove this, and this is why we win this debate. I'm very proud to